Yeah, look, if I lived in Havana and I was in the government, I'd be concerned, at least a little bit.
Cutting off the oil flow to Cuba from Venezuela?
Well, the president already announced a week ago that anything that's sanctioned, it's sanctioned oil, it's not going to be allowed to get there. So that's a pre-existing.
A few moments later.
Now at Havana, Cuba, where the power is out across the entire island, according to local officials there. Cuba is under a U.S. energy blockade. It has not had any oil shipments in 3 months.
So it's certainly no secret that the downfall of Cuba has already began. Of course, after losing their best friend in Venezuela, the failed Marxist state has been dealing with energy shortages and rolling blackouts for several weeks now. But tonight may be the final symbolic nail in the coffin, because it now turns out that the entire nation has lost electricity all at once. That is right. Today, Cuba was gripped by a large island-wide blackout. Previously, they were dealing with a lot of blackouts, but it was usually just one region of the country at a time. Now, the entire island has lost power, and this is, of course, coming at the same time when Trump is once again ramping his rhetoric up of some type of U.S. takeover of Cuba in the same way we just did to great success in Venezuela. So we'll update you on all of this. But at the same time, I do want to address a lot of the leftist grieving and a constant seething about what you're watching right now, because, you know, you're going to hear a lot of the same exact garbage that we've heard for several decades, the excuses made for the Cuban regime that go somewhere along the lines of, oh, well, Cuba's only failing and starving and doesn't have a functioning economy because of American imperialism or the embargo or something. Now, never mind the fact that the very Cuban revolution that these people celebrate was based entirely on the premise that we want America out of our island. And then now they cry victim because America doesn't trade with Cuba anymore. So that's why Cuba's starving, even though you fought the revolution because you didn't want anything to do with America. It makes absolutely no sense. But at the same time, let's be completely real about this. Much like after Maduro, but Cuba might be even worse. The reason a lot of these socialist activist characters are so deeply hurt by what they're watching is because they're losing one of their biggest heroes, arguably an even bigger hero than Hugo Chavez and Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela even were. Which is to say, it should be no surprise that the people who have been protesting for years wearing Che Guevara shirts are, of course, aggrieved at the fact that, the regime they celebrate and idolize for so long has now come to its inevitable collapse. Of course, these people will do nothing but seethe and make excuses about it, but it's just the simple reality. In the end, it only took about 60 years, but so-called American imperialism or colonialism, whatever you want to call it, go ahead. It won. It won. So in the end, who's the winner here? Who's the loser, right? Just saying. But anyways, let's address all of it, guys. First, though, do us a favor. If you enjoy our content, make sure you hit that like button down below. Subscribe to the channel if you are new. We greatly appreciate the support, but it also ensures that you can stay up to date with all of the latest news and coverage. And that said, let's start by first talking about the current blackout. Of course, we know that the entire lifeline, essentially the only thing that was propping up Cuba as a nation at all, was Venezuelan oil for the past about decade and a half, right? It's been the case that the Chavez and then later on Maduro regime was selling them oil at a subsidized rate, and it was basically the only way that the Cuban economy could get anything. After Maduro was toppled, the Venezuelan oil pipeline has, of course, been cut off. Likewise, they did formerly get some oil from Mexico. Due to Trump's Latin America policy, Mexico has also agreed to stop selling that very oil to Cuba. And of course, ever since losing that, it is now the case that a country that touted its supposed independence and self-reliance for many decades, now without its subsidized foreign aid and foreign energy, is now looking like this right here.
Microsystems are starting back up following another island-wide blackout in Cuba. The Ministry of Energy and Mines is investigating what it calls a, quote, complete disconnection of the country's electrical system. It comes just over a week after the last outage affecting the western part of the island. Cuba has blamed its energy woes on a U.S. oil blockade after President Trump warned of tariffs on any country that sells or provides oil to Cuba.
And meanwhile, Cuban Americans living in South Florida are now being invited to invest on the island.
It's the first move signaling Cuba is open to having relations with the U.S. CBS News Miami's Yvonne Taylor is live in Miami with the mixed reactions. Yvonne?
Yvonne, Lauren, Cuban experts as well as activists tell me that this is another sign of the crisis. Today, Cuban exiles are saying that the regime is desperate and is now seeking help from the ones who once were considered enemies of the Cuban Revolution.
That will not work.
Ramon Saul Sanchez, president of the Democracy Movement in Miami, did not hesitate to respond this Monday to the news coming from Havana that Cuba is open to having a fluid commercial relationship with U.S. companies and also with Cubans residing in the United States.
We are asking the administration not to engage to stabilize economically the regime by having business people from here go and do business with the regime in Cuba.
Es una práctica soberana.
The announcement comes after the island's leader, Miguel Diaz Canel, admitted Friday that Cuba is indeed in talks with the Trump administration.
Now, I will certainly say I think those are all valid points. It is deeply hypocritical for the Cuban regime to have formerly branded Cuban American exiles as the enemies of the state, and then now years later are begging them to come back and bring in their money and foreign investment simply because they are in dire financial straits. I get the concern that if some type of mild economic reform is embraced, that might not mean serious or meaningful regime change or a toppling of the Marxist system. But what I would say in response is that, well, I think it's very clear what the Trump administration just did in Venezuela. And it maybe if you even want to argue that, oh, well, you know, the new leader was Maduro's VP, so has anything really changed? I think it's very clear that things have changed. Because not only are diplomatic relations being reopened with the United States, not only have they essentially cut off Russia and China and are now acting as a oil tributary state to America instead. We just saw, for example, this week, the announcements that airlines are once again opening flights to Caracas and the official flag-raising ceremony right here at the U.S. Embassy in Venezuela, but even domestically at the same time. We told you previously about how the new Venezuelan president announced that she would be closing down the country's notorious political prison. So she freed the political prisoners. They're apparently trying to turn that now into a center for children. And so, yes, while the regime might still be a part of Maduro's party on paper, and the Trump administration's fine with that for the sake of a continuity of leadership or stability, yes, in every meaningful sense, Venezuela is changing for the better. And I would argue if this all goes through in Cuba, you're going to watch a very similar situation. As a matter of fact, we just got the news in the last hour out of the New York Times, and so take this with a grain of salt, but I wouldn't mind believing it. This might actually be the type of story that the White House feeds to the press on purpose, because as you can see right here, the Trump administration said to tell Cuba that its president has to go, ladies and gentlemen. Again, in the past hour here, the United States has told Cuba that for meaningful progress to be made in the negotiations, President Miguel Diaz-Canel must step down. Okay, so here is the story. As Cuban and U.S. officials negotiate over the future of the island, the Trump administration is seeking to push out the president, according to 4 people familiar with the talks. The move would topple a key figurehead but leave in place the communist government, as you know, the New York Times here is trying to argue. Again, you could say the same thing about Venezuela, but I would argue that's not in reality what is happening here. But here is the important part. Okay, so in the view of some Trump administration officials, removing Cuba's head of state would allow structural economic changes in the country that Diaz-Canel, whom the officials consider a hardliner, is unlikely to support, one of the people there had said. So this guy's trying to cling to his failed and awful and terrible Marxist system, and the U.S. is basically saying, I think this guy's got to go. So who knows? I don't know. Maybe they'll snatch him pretty soon. We'll keep an eye there on what happens for sure. But of course, here's what Trump likewise had to say about Cuba from the Oval Office just a couple hours ago.
I think Cuba, is in its own way, for tourism and everything else, it's a beautiful island, great weather. They're not in a hurricane zone, which is nice for a change, They won't be asking us for money for hurricanes every week. But I think Cuba's the end. All my life I've been hearing about the United States and Cuba. When will the United States do it? I do believe I'll be having the honor of taking Cuba. That'd be good. That's a big honor.
Taking Cuba.
Taking Cuba in some form, yeah. Taking Cuba. I mean, whether I free it, take it, I think I could do anything I want with it. You want to know the truth? They're a very weakened nation right now. They were for a long time. Very violent leaders
So yeah, certainly in one form or another, Cuba is completely done. As Trump notes, and he is correct about, they have no cards left, and their collapse in some form is certainly an inevitability at this point. Now, that said, it is, of course, triggering the normal excuses from leftists who try to argue that, well, Cuba is only collapsing because of American interference. They're currently arguing that America is starving Cuba. It's so cruel and mean. It violates international law. It's a humanitarian crisis and all this stuff. You know, never the issue with the Cuban regime, according to them, has never been that their own system sucks. Their economic management is completely inefficient, which is why their people starve. And this sort of third world copium that, you know, it was perfectly fine if not for the evil white countries oppressing everybody else is just not true. But of course, these people invent the usual excuses, which is why today I actually want to respond to that, right? Let's go through the history of the way left-wingers have tried to defend Cuba and why they're just so fundamentally wrong about that by starting from the beginning, right? Even before the oil blockade, and let's address, right, what leftists seem to believe. Because I want to remind the left here that it's actually been the case since the 1960s and the Cuban Revolution, led by Fidel Castro, that the entire point of that was what? The entire premise and rallying cry of the Cuban Revolution was what? That they wanted America out of Cuba. That's what Fidel fought for before he even publicly identified as a communist. The central premise of the revolution was that Cuba right now basically exists as a de facto American colony. We don't want that. We want all of these American businesses and interests out of our island. We want our own quote unquote independence is what it was really about. So, of course, and by the way, leftists glorify Fidel Castro. They glorify the Cuban Revolution to this very day. Why? Because it was supposedly anti-colonialist and anti-imperialist. Okay. Well, then what happened? After Fidel won the revolution, he seized a lot of American assets. He drove American interests out of the island. Well, after the Cubans pretty clearly said, we don't want to do business with America, America said, fine, we won't do business with you. So they slapped what? The famous trade embargo on Cuba. No trade, no business with Cuba. To which leftists, even before the whole Venezuela crisis, have said for many years that, oh, well, Cuba's only failing because of the American embargo. It's so mean for America to put the embargo on. To which I repeat, that's what you guys asked for. Is that not what Fidel Castro asked for when he said, we don't want to do business with America? And then after realizing, oh, shoot, we're poor, we're starving, turns out we kind of needed America. Now they're in their right to go and beg, hey, why don't you do trade with us? You said you didn't want us there. Like, what is the argument here? What's the concern, you know? So that's why the whole embargo argument from the left wing really never made sense to me. No, the reality is, by the way, too, the only thing to blame for Cuba's total abject failure, it's constant starvation, it's constant power shortages, which, by the way, were still a thing even before Nicolas Maduro toppled, was, of course, the failures of Marxism. And it's just very hilarious that left-wingers see all these countries throughout modern history collapse for the same exact reasons and still never look to blame their own stupid ideas for being the reason those countries collapsed, okay? Because let's point this out as well. Okay, so even if you want to reject my argument, that the real reason Cuba has had such problems is because of the fact that their terrible, failed, inefficient economic system causes the starvation. It causes the mismanagement of resources that hence makes there be no food, no electricity, etc., etc. Okay, fine. You can claim Cuba was because only American imperialism. Then to that I ask, why did the USSR collapse then? Why has basically every communist country in history collapsed? Let me actually address that, right? Did the USSR, the mighty big bloc of basically Russia and a bunch of other countries, okay, did that also fail due to American imperialism? Was that just America bullying a small island nation? Or was that because of the fact that, oh, wait a minute, throughout the 1980s and the modernization of the world, their economic system literally could not keep up, nor could the political system, and so it caved in on itself. Oh no, well, let's invent some excuse for that. I don't get it. I don't get it, right? Why did the USSR collapse then, right? North Korea, by the way. North Korea is a country that is way over on the other side of the world. They're not this tiny island that's like directly right next to America. They directly border, as a matter of fact, China and Russia. They get a lot of aid from those countries. Why does North Korea starve then, leftists? Huh? Is that also because of American imperialism? I mean, please explain that to me. By the way, why did other communist countries like China, like Vietnam, basically drop the communist thing in the 1980s and move toward more market reforms in a capitalist-leaning system, basically out of necessity because the Marxist system was doing what? Failing to feed their people. Are you noticing a common pattern here, leftists? It doesn't matter if the country is small or large. It doesn't matter if there's an American trade embargo on a tiny island or not. No, the problem here is what? Marxism, socialism, communism, whatever you want to call them, all of these ideas of like pro-leftist centrally planned economies do not work, and that's why they collapsed, okay? You can blame the embargo all you want, but hey, Cuba could have still done business with the rest of the world. I'd also like to point out that contrary to the leftist glorification of the Cuban Revolution, folks, that Cuba was never truly independent, okay? You know, they claim they sought independence from America and, oh, that's so amazing, anti-colonialism. In reality, all that happened was that they went from being a puppet state of America to a puppet state of the USSR. We know that because, by the way, the only thing that propped up and kept alive the Cuban economy throughout the 70s, 80s, and early 90s was Soviet foreign aid. And what happened, much like in North Korea as a result of the Soviet Union collapsing in 1991, is that the Cuban economy immediately, folks, this is a true stat, true number, shrunk by 40%. That is right. They lost 40% of their economy when they lost foreign aid from the Soviet Union. And yet leftists want to sit here and claim that the system is so amazing, right? Cuba was independent. No, they weren't. They simply just flipped under one sphere of influence to another one, right? And again, I say, are you noticing a pattern there? Are you noticing an issue of, oh, this idea really sucks and it can't even exist on its own without being, you lose half of your freaking economy without essentially foreign aid, being able to bail you out there?
August 5th, 1994 went down in Cuban history as the Maleconazo. For the first time since the triumph of the revolution, thousands of Cubans took to the streets in a spontaneous protest against the Castro regime. News of the Maleconazo spread like wildfire across media outlets around the world, despite Havana's tight control on information. Many analysts agreed that this was the last drop in a sea of desperation caused by a shortage of food and staples during the so-called special period, a legacy left by the collapse of the former Soviet Union.
And by the way, the same is true even with Venezuela, okay? So why is Cuba currently collapsing? Why are they currently out of electricity and essentially probably going to be out of food here very soon? Well, after, of course, they lost nearly half of their economy due to the collapse of the Soviet Union, in the early 2000s, the Hugo Chavez regime, in the name of socialist solidarity, basically agreed to start selling Cuba oil at a subsidized rate. I want to make that clear. They didn't even sell Cuba oil at the market rate because Cuba was so poor they couldn't afford the market rate. No, they gave them subsidized oil, which basically, by the way, was what? Another form of foreign aid. So you're noticing a pattern here, right? The people who cry about Cuban independence are defending a regime that literally cannot exist without foreign aid. But oh, if America goes to invest there, oh, if Cuba falls back under America, that's really bad. Well, please explain to me. I mean, they're not going to be independent either way, right? So again, I ask, are you noticing a pattern there, right? So at a certain point, you have to just acknowledge the problem with Cuba is the system itself. But anyways, that said, as it pertains to the current, so that's me addressing, the Cuban argument for many decades now. But as it pertains currently to the energy crisis right now, okay, so because you lost Venezuela and that aid pipeline, you're completely out of energy. Well, then at the same time, you have to ask the question, okay, well, aren't they leftists? Aren't they supposed to be like woke, considering woke people glorify them? Why does Cuba have no meaningful investment in things like hydroelectric, biomass power, solar energy, by the way? Their island gets plenty of sun. I'm not, by the way, saying that it would be realistic to expect them to entirely rely on green energy, but why, when they lose oil from basically one country, does their country completely collapse? Well, again, that's a question to be asked there. The answer there is what? They can't invest in any of those things because, I repeat, the Marxist-Leninist centrally planned economy sucks that bad, leftists, that they never had the capacity to even figure out a way to keep the lights on in their island. So all they had to do was, oh, Russia, give us stuff. Venezuela, give us stuff. Free stuff, free stuff. Basically, they were taking free stuff from other countries. And then once the free stuff pipeline is over, now they're out of energy. They're completely starving. They're in a blackout, you know? But of course, right, that surely the reason for that is all just because of America or something. No, the excuses there are dumb. They don't really make any sense. And by the way, as it pertains to America, as it pertains to what Trump is doing right now, I think, you know, although maybe the Cuba threat is not what it was in, say, 1963, it can't be understated how much of a gigantic, at least symbolic success this would be for the Trump administration. You know, ever since the 60s, every U.S. president in some form wanted Cuba to either fall or open up, and even Obama failed to do so. JFK, obviously, at the beginning, botched the Bay of Pigs and that whole problem. And now it is finally the case that America is getting this job done. You love to see it. And by the way, as it pertains to the potential threat that Cuba poses, let me repeat sort of the argument here. Because some people may ask, well, the Cold War is over, right? What does it really matter that Cuba is there? That, you know, it's still never been good for America to have a hostile Marxist regime just 90 miles from our shore. But if you believe in the 21st century that maybe that's changed a bit and Cuba's not really trying to fight anymore, I want to remind everyone the type of headlines we saw just a couple years ago out of Cuba under the Biden administration.
Today, Russian warships arrived in Cuba. Cuba's describing this as a routine visit and is the second one in as many months. Cuban authorities sent shots into the air to signal the warships' welcome, while fishermen watch from Havana's waterside promenade as the ships approach the bay. Russian residents were also among those watching the fleet's arrival. The ships are scheduled to depart Tuesday, and the United States says they're keeping an eye on this situation, but don't believe this to be a major threat.
Anyone remember that, by the way? Anyone remember watching Cuba and Russia start to rebuild ties in the 21st century? China as well, too, by the way, obviously. Anyone remember Russia parking warships basically right off the United States using Cuba as a base? That's why Cuba in the 21st century still matters. I mean, don't get me wrong. It's certainly the case that Venezuela was the much bigger problem in Latin America, but that's not to say that Cuba nowadays is no longer a problem. So when you ask, you know, what benefit is it to the United States now for the Cuban regime to fall? Well, for many of the same reasons, actually, as the 1960s. And as you're watching a world where the sort of geopolitical arms race is heating up again, you could say the new Cold War is already started or approaching, and certainly there's the sort of a clash of empires that you see happening in the world, then it's still the case that it's never been good to have a hostile, Eastern-aligned Marxist regime 90 miles from the United States. And if you can make that collapse and you have the tools to do so, absolutely you should. Not to mention, by the way, the economic gains, especially in that region, right, South Florida and others, that could be seen as a result of an opening up of Cuba. You know, that's certainly another just good thing to have, okay? So this is all to say, right, that honestly, I think, first of all, you consider the Monroe Doctrine. You consider the fact that despite whatever the sort of isolationist or leftist or whatever crowd wants to say about it, it's the truth about America for all of its history. We've always been imperialistic in Latin America. It's always been historic American foreign policy that this is our sphere of influence and we deserve to exert that influence over this part of the world. I would argue that really America should have probably annexed Cuba in the 1890s after the Spanish-American War. We were not able to do so because, you know, having claimed the whole war was for Cuban independence, it would have been a bad look to do that. I get that, but likewise, I think the problem should have been solved in the 60s. I think it would have been much strategically smarter for America to solve Cuba than to solve Vietnam, but JFK mishandled that whole thing, so that wasn't able to happen, okay? But all that's happening now, right, is that America is simply reclaiming its own hemisphere, which, I repeat, has always been historic American foreign policy, and I don't think it needs particular explaining as to why it's good to control your own backyard, right? It's good to control your own hemisphere. And of course, that's what we are very clearly here on the verge of doing. And so the leftists, of course, are upset because the regime they idolize and glorify so much is just done. It's done. And by the way, I'd argue too, that's not just a major victory for America. That's a major victory, let's be honest, for the right wing, right? In sort of the same symbolic sense that the downfall of the Soviet Union was that kind of vindication of the American right. Same thing here, I'd argue, as it pertains to Venezuela and Cuba. It is true. But anyways, that said, guys, let me know your thoughts on this in the comment section down below. Be sure to leave a like on this video, subscribe to the channel if you are new, and until next time, God bless and peace.